We're going to preach for the next 4 weeks on the book of Revelation. Not long enough, Simon says. Okay, there's a response I was not expecting to hear. Just because you're a Bible theologian nerd. There's always a multiple number of responses to this book. And perhaps, with everything going on in the world, with the situation in Bondi yesterday, with the storms here, with the threat of Iran going to attack Israel at the moment, and all that's going on in the world, you might expect that a lot of churches, and I'm sure you'll find in a lot of churches, that the pastors will have their whiteboards out and they'll be telling you how Iran is like the Antichrist and how it all fits together in the global, plan of God. Well, if that's what you might be thinking this morning, you're going to be disappointed, because that's not what Pastor Rowan is going to do today at all. We're going to take over the next 4 weeks a completely different look at the book of Revelation than seeing it as some kind of predictor of end time events. We're going to come at it differently. And just last week, there was a lot of talk in the United States because there was an eclipse that you might have heard about. You might have seen it on your Instagram feed. There was an eclipse, but that eclipse was just over the United States. It wasn't over the rest of the world. But because it happened in the United States, somehow it became the center of God's prophecy. But it didn't happen over the rest of the world. Eclipses happen all the time. They just don't always happen over the United States. So we need to just be prepared for the fact that Jesus says, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, and you hear of these things, he says, these things aren't the end. They're just the beginning of birth pains. Throughout history, challenging times have come. Challenging times go, and more challenging times come again. And so, as we talk about Revelation, we're going to take a different tack at it. And I wonder what your response is when you hear me say, preaching from the book of Revelation. As I look around the room, there's a number of you who have been Christians for many years, so no doubt at some point you have been exposed to something around the teaching of the book of Revelation. You've heard it, or you've seen stuff, or you've read books. Anyone ever read the Left Behind series of novels? Few people, not too many, okay. Well, I'm not going to go into all the stuff that I used to believe that I don't necessarily hold to anymore. We're not going to go down that. But I just want you to think about, what is it that you might feel when we say we're talking about the book of Revelation? And apart from Simon, who says 4 weeks isn't long enough. No, that's all right. You're with Simon, okay. Well, sometimes people will go, oh, I don't like it. It's too scary. All the dragons and all that kind of stuff. That's all weird and scary, confusing. Okay, so too scary can be something. Too confusing is often a response. I don't bother about it because it's just too confusing. I'll just skip it out, just get to the end of the book of Jude. The last few verses of Jude's confusing enough. Even before I get into the book of Revelation, I'll stop without the book of Revelation because it's too confusing, like Kenny said. Or maybe you just think it's not relevant. Maybe you think, it's all to do with predicting the future events, and it's not of any good to me today, in my life today, so it's not relevant. So it might be too scary, it might be too confusing, might not be irrelevant. Or you may have yourself or know people who have gone the other way. Rather than avoiding the book of Revelation, they've centered their entire faith around the book of Revelation. Does anybody ever know anyone who does that? Anyone feel like you may have already done that at some point in your life? Because I know I've been there. I've done that at some point in my life. And you can kind of get down the rabbit hole, and you're looking for all kinds of meaning in all the things that are in there, and trying to predict it and match it with news reports. And the prime minister of this place must be the Antichrist, and going through all this trying to predict end times and what's going to happen at the end. And I've held to that teaching. I was taught that kind of what they call dispensational teaching. Left behind theology, if you like. I was taught it in Bible college. I held to it. I can still argue it with the best of them, actually. But over more recent years, as I've grown in my theology, I've had to recognize that I think I've come to see that book I've come to see the book of Revelation in a very different light to that. And I actually think that I was wrong now. And I've actually had the maps and charts up. I've taught all the maps and charts and things. But I'm going to come at it totally differently in these next few weeks as we preach. And I think Brian Nacken's going to preach next week. He gets to preach on finding hope in the face of suffering next week. So be praying for Brian this week as he prepares. Please do. We're going to come at this book differently. Now, I'm not expecting that everyone will automatically be where I am, because I've been very much of the dispensational view, and you might still be. That's what you've learned, that's what you've taught, what you've been taught, or what you've taught others. Just come with me on the journey. And just have an open mind. I'm encouraging everybody, whether you're a person who holds a very strong view of the theology of the end times and Revelation, or whether you've just been a person who've avoided it. I'm inviting you on a journey with us because I believe that this book can actually be a source of hope to us. It can be a source of hope in the midst of hardship, and it can also be a challenge to us as to how we conduct ourselves in the world around us. Now, I'm going to give a bit of an overview this morning, and then we're going to pull out a couple of thoughts that are key themes that I want you to be taking through the journey as you go through the next few weeks on the book of Revelation. But one of the things that's worth noting, and I missed this because I was so focused on the end time stuff, the book of Revelation is actually chock-a-block full of worship of the Lord Jesus. It's all over the book. Songs like, we used to sing them in the 90s. Who remembers "Salvation Belongs to Our God Who Sits Upon the Throne"? All these beautiful songs and hymns, great hymns of time. It's chock-a-block full of visions of Jesus, worship of Jesus. And for a people it was written to in the first century, these are the people it was written to. It wasn't written to the people in the end times who are going to come in the future. It was written to 7 churches in the province of Asia, which is modern Western Turkey, in the first century, who were suffering hardship, misrepresentation, misunderstanding. They were under the persecution of Rome. They were being infiltrated by the value system of the Roman Empire, and they were trying to find a way to, what does it mean to follow Jesus in the midst of all of that? And with that in mind, it was written to them, and it was called to bring them hope. It was called to cause them to stand firm in the midst of challenges. And that's what I want us to do. I want us to be able to see it through that light as we go through the book. And the vision of Jesus is what keeps them going all the way through. And so the first thing I want to point out here is the 2 goals that I have for this series. The first one is I want us to have an apocalypse of the eschaton. Say that to your friend next to you. An apocalypse. You need to have an apocalypse of the eschaton. Well, I've given you the answer there underneath in less bold writing. An apocalypse of the eschaton. What is an apocalypse of the eschaton? It's a revelation of the end. A revelation of the end of days. And that is what this book is primarily about. It's speaking to a people who are facing hardship, under suffering. Things aren't working out the way they thought that they would. Hardship, like we've seen and continue to see in the world. People suffering. What do you do when you don't have the answers? When you're crying out, God, when will justice come? And the book of Revelation would say, if you can grasp an apocalypse of the eschaton, a revelation of the end of days. So when I say the word apocalyptic, what comes to mind for you? Bruce Willis. Doomsday. Yeah. There's a brand new series that just came out, just released in the last couple of days, called Fallout, which is an apocalyptic. There's all kinds of apocalyptic movies. I mean, it seems like every television show or movie that comes out is in that apocalyptic genre. And we say the word apocalyptic just means like the end of the world kind of stuff, like, zombie apocalypse. That's the term we use, right? All this end of the world sort of stuff. I'm fascinated with that. Doomsday stuff, yeah. Doomsday preppers. Yes, that's right. So we think, and look, and the church has been, large portions of the church have done that, try to be ready for the end and the tribulation and all that, right? But the word apocalypse doesn't actually mean any of that. The word apocalypse, apocalypto in Greek, it just means an unveiling. If I've got a curtain here, and we're going to come back to this in a moment, imagine there's a curtain here, and the curtain's closed, and behind the curtain, we're ready to see the performance. Jill and I went and saw West Side Story. There was no curtain on. We went and watched West Side Story with Jill's sister and brother-in-law on Friday night. There's no curtain because it was on the harbour. But imagine you're in the opera house and there's a curtain closed. And you don't know what's happening behind the curtain. Well, when the curtain pulls back, guess what that is? That's an apocalypse. That's what the word means. It just means a pulling back of the curtain, a drawing back so you can see what's behind it, a revealing of something that was hidden. That's an apocalypse. It only gets the meaning of apocalypse in terms of end times because of this very book that we're getting into, because this book seems to deal with things about the end. So we've taken it and made it all this dark, end of the world kind of stuff, because that's what it looks like we're reading in the book of Revelation. So we want us to have an apocalypse of the eschaton. And eschaton is just a Greek word for the end. So in a nutshell, if we can, when we're faced with suffering, and this book wants us to get this, if we can have a vision of the end, The day when Jesus returns and wipes away every tear and rights every wrong and cancels out all injustice and brings healing, and heaven is reunited with earth, if we can have that apocalypse of that eschaton, that is what will keep us going through tragedies like Mondi, through houses being washed away in floods, through wars and rumours of wars. If you can have a glimpse of something that one day he will right everyone wrong. That's what an apocalypse of the eschaton is all about. That's why this book is not supposed to be scary. It's got some scary stuff in it, but it's not supposed to be scary. It was written to encourage them to have an apocalypse of the eschaton. So that's the first thing, of the two things, goals as we read Revelation. Now the other one is less encouraging and more challenging. And the other theme, we're going to see an example of both of these before we finish this morning. The other theme is, how do we as Christians relate to the culture around us? How do we relate to a culture that one wants to just take us out, is anti the things of God, a worldly system that is opposed to the values of God, God's kingdom values, or will try to force itself upon us so that we accommodate to it, so that we allow the systems and values of the world which are against God to get into us. And so both of these things were happening for these fledgling 7 churches in Asia. Both aspects were very real. They were facing persecution and they needed an apocalypse of the eschaton. But they were also facing the temptation to find out where they fit and how much of the culture they could bring into them. And so you'll see I've got 3 crosses and 1 tick there, because there's a pressure on us as Christians to accommodate to the culture. We just let the culture of the world and its value systems economically and its value systems socially and its value systems ethnically and all of that, we let that infiltrate the church so we don't look any different to the world around us. And I get that that's a hard line. How much do you accommodate and how much don't you accommodate? But the churches in Asia Minor where this was written to, they were facing that same challenge as we're facing today. They were facing the challenge to let the value systems of the world come in and accommodate to the culture. The next one is domination of the culture. Now, in the first century, when the church was just getting started, this is written in the first 50 years or so after Jesus, the concept of the Christian church dominating the culture was so foreign to them. They had no concept that one day that church could topple the great kingdom of Caesar. Caesar was the son of God to the world around. They worshipped Caesar, the whole Roman Imperium. That was the thing that was so dominant that the thought of domination never entered their mind. I actually don't even know that it entered into the Apostle Paul's mind, other than that he saw that one day Jesus would come, and that's when the kingdom of God would dominate and rule the kingdoms of this world. But prior to that, I don't think it entered into his mind. But within 300 years, Rome had toppled to the Christian church, and it became the dominant culture. And do you know what happened when the church became the dominant culture? It did not go well for the church or the world around it. Because what happens is power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and you end up with the long and complicated history of the Crusades and the popes appointing kings and all kinds of stuff. And I'm not talking about the Catholic Church, I'm talking about the Christian church. And we, for a long time in the West, I think the church has had a domination of the culture. It's had a domination mentality in the culture. And now as things shift again, sometimes Christians have lost some sense of domination of the culture, and we're fighting back. So what happens is we go, okay, we don't want to accommodate to the culture, we don't want to dominate the culture, so we'll just isolate from the culture. We'll just go back into our little enclave and we'll just sing Kumbaya and stay away from the world and don't let it infect us at all. We'll just live completely in a hole and separate ourselves or distance ourselves. And you all know of different sects in the Christian church that have done that very thing too. And I think what this book calls us to do is none of those 3. I think this book is calling us to integrate into the culture, to find a way, as Jesus said, to be in the world, but what? Not of the world. Not to isolate from the world, but be in the world, but not of the world. There is a way, and it's messy. And sometimes we go too far one way, and sometimes we go too far the other. But there is a way where the Christian church and all of us in our neighbourhoods and our schools and our communities, we are part of this culture. But we need to live in such a way that what's on us gets on others rather than what's on others gets on us. To be in the world and not of the world. That's the challenge of the book of Revelation. Twofold challenge. Stay faithful to the end and integrate well into the culture so that you represent Jesus well. So I want us to take those two main themes as we head into the next few weeks and as we read through different parts of the book. Now, one way just to understand how to read the book of Revelation is to come at it like you would come at it, not as some kind of end times predictive book, but come at it as you might come at a C.S. Lewis Narnia Chronicles series or the Lord of the Rings series. It's very similar. It's a very similar genre to those sorts of things, actually. It's rich in meaning. It's got political satire, just like those did. It's got very similar fantasy fiction kind of feel to it. But in all of those cases, whether it's Tolkien or Lewis, they actually had that kind of undertone of victory over the forces of darkness. And all great stories, don't they? Whether it's Lewis or Tolkien or a Marvel movie, it's something about us that captures us, the titanic struggle between good and evil. It's in everything. There's something. Why is it in everything and why does it appeal to us? Because it's life. We understand that there is this battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and we like it when the forces of evil prevail. And the reason that the forces of good prevail, because, got that wrong, didn't I? We like it when the forces of good prevail because intuitively we know that's what we're looking for in the world. And that's what the gospel, the story of Jesus is all about, his triumph over the forces of evil. And so we can read this book, we can explain this book through this light of seeing it as a battle between good and evil, where it might seem like evil will win, but in the end, good triumphs over evil. Justice triumphs over injustice, and everything is put right. I've got in my notes here Star Wars, and I'm thinking that must just be because it is. It's the same thing, the battle of the light side and the dark side of the Force. Now, I know that I don't want to dig into it too much because we understand that the light side of Jesus is, the power of Jesus is so much bigger than the power of darkness. And a lot of these stories have them kind of allied with each other, right? Well, sometimes it actually feels like, if we're honest, if we just put on an honest hat and not our really religious Christian hat for a minute, sometimes it actually feels like the dark side is more powerful than the light side, doesn't it? You know that's not intuitively the right thing to say because Christians don't say that, but doesn't it feel like that? And that's what this book's about. It's actually to remind you that even though you cannot see the light side wins. The plan of God will come about. And it seemed like that to this early church. It seemed like the dark side was prevailing. And into that comes Jesus to bring a vision of the future, a vision of the light side. And so we're going to just do a little intro to the book, and then we're going to look at two letters that Jesus speaks to the church. We're going to have communion, and we'll be done. Now, I wanted to kind of just give you an overview of the framework of how to read the book of Revelation, so that this might be helpful. I actually discussed this in the podcast, that I think the one that will be out tomorrow morning as well, but you'll get it ahead of time. So let's go back to our stage analogy. That'll help us. Imagine you're going to see a show, and what's on at the Opera House at the moment? I think our friends were there last night. Can't think what's going on. Sorry? No, I can't remember what it was. Anyway, you go to the Opera House, the curtain's closed, you can't see the band in the pit, you're just mingling as you come in. You know, you hear the band do their tune-up thing, what's it called? Whatever they do, they make the crazy music. Whatever they do. Tune up. No, the thing where they go, it sounds like they're completely out of tune. They're all playing something that's all completely out of tune, whatever it was. And they're down in the pit, and all you can see is just the curtain and nothing on the stage. And you get the sense that something's about to happen. And as you do that, all you see is what's right in front of you. And that's written like to the churches in Turkey. All they could see was what was right in front of them. All they could see was the persecution and the infiltration of Roman systems into the world around them. It seemed like they could not see anything behind that curtain. And from behind the curtain, this is just how I like to picture this book of Revelation. Behind the curtain, a man comes out from behind the curtain, it closes behind him, and he stands out the front. And he gives a bit of a prologue. And he introduces himself. And this is how he introduces himself. It's Revelation chapter 1. He stands and he says, "This is the revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place." This is the unveiling of Jesus Christ. The curtain's still closed. He sent an angel to present this revelation to his servant John. And the person that's standing there introduces himself as John. "I'm John. And this is what he's saying. He's talking to us, the church, the people who are facing the challenges. And I, John, faithfully reported everything that I saw. This is the report of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. God blesses anyone who reads the words of this prophecy to the church. And he blesses all who listen to its message and obey what it says, for the time is near. God blesses us. There is a blessing when we read these words. There is a blessing for us. There is an encouragement for us. And then John goes on and says, this letter I'm writing to you, this show I'm about to show you, is from John to the 7 churches in the province of Asia. Grace and peace to you from the one who is, who always was, and who is still to come, and from the sevenfold Spirit before his throne, and from Jesus Christ. He is the faithful witness to these things, the first to rise from the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the world. Let me tell you, I, John, your brother and your partner in the suffering that you're experiencing and God's kingdom, and in the patient endurance that we all need because of the hardships to which Jesus has called us to endure. I was exiled on the island of Patmos because I'd been preaching the word of God for my testimony about Jesus. John was preaching about Jesus and the authorities didn't like him very much, so they sent him off the mainland and put him on an island. Legend has it, it's just legend, that they actually tried to boil him in oil and he survived it. And so Caesar thought, well, I can't do that again. That will look really dumb, so they put him on an island. That's the legend that goes with this. And he says, I was on Patmos because of the testimony about Jesus. It was the Lord's day, just like it is today, and I was worshipping Jesus on Sunday. I was worshipping in the Spirit, and suddenly I heard behind me a loud trumpet blast. So he stepped up on here as though he's behind the curtain pulls back, and he says, I was on the island of Patmos. Here I was, worshipping Jesus. And suddenly, behind me, I heard a loud voice like a trumpet blast, and it said, write in the book everything you see and send it to the 7 churches in the cities of Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. 7 churches, all within a short distance of each other, up and down the Meander Valley. In that part of the world, it's only a few hundred kilometers. Send this vision to these churches. And when I turned to see who was speaking to me, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and standing in the middle of the lampstands was someone like a son of man. And he was wearing a long robe with a gold sash around his chest. His hair was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like flames of fire. His feet were like polished bronze refined in a furnace, and his voice thundered like mighty ocean waves. And he held 7 stars in his right hand, and a sharp 2-edged sword came from his mouth. And his face was like the sun in all its brilliance. And this vision here is not one that I did. I could have got Simon to do a much better job. That one there was a short, it's not perfect, but I just asked ChatGPT to draw me a picture of Jesus in Patmos. And for some reason, GPT doesn't like doing things exactly as you want, because I asked for 7 lampstands and I could not get it to give me 7. It kept giving me 8. And I couldn't get it to put stars in his right hand. So that was just like a short little brief effort. But you can sort of see something of what he saw there. Some kind of glimpse that he's on Patmos and it's just all he sees around him is just ocean. Exiled on an island. Mind you, if you're going to be exiled on any island, a Greek island's probably a good one to get exiled on. But anyway, it's probably one of the better choices in the world. But he was on the island and he turned and he saw a vision, something like that. Just goes on describing what we see here. Full of imagery. There's 7 lampstands. Jesus is radiating like the sun. And all of these are all symbols that are all in the Old Testament. It's all full of symbolism. But he captures this vision of Jesus standing with him on the island of Patmos. And Jesus begins to dictate to him 7 letters that he wants him to say. He says in verse 17, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as if I were dead. But he laid his right hand on me and said, don't be afraid. I reckon I'd probably fall on the ground like I was dead if I saw that too, wouldn't you? I mean, that's pretty awe-inspiring vision. He said, don't be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I died, but look, I'm alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and the grave. To a people who are suffering death and persecution, to know that Jesus holds the keys to death and the grave is an encouragement thing. It might feel like you're locked up. It might feel like death is reigning, but Jesus is going, I reign over death. I hold the keys. Write down what you've seen, both the things that are now happening and the things that will happen. He says, this is the meaning of the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in your right hand and the 7 golden lampstands. The 7 stars are the 7 angels or the 7 messengers or the 7 pastors, depending on what version you have, of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So this picture is Jesus appearing to John to tell the churches, hey, it might feel like I'm not around you, but I'm standing right in the middle of the churches. I'm right there. The 7 churches, I'm surrounding them. They surround me. I'm right in the heart of your church. It might not feel like I'm there right now, but trust me, I am. And this is like an unveiling, because they can't see this. But just in this moment, there's this revelation, there's this unveiling of what's really going on, that heaven is closer than we think. When we're facing hardship, heaven is closer than we think. And he holds the keys to death and Hades in his hand. He is there, and he has, right in his hand, he holds these 7 leaders. His heart is for the church. And so he has this vision. John has this vision. And chapters 2 and 3 continue, before we come back to chapters 2 and 3, chapters 2 and 3 continue in this first scene of the play. It's on the island of Patmos. And in this first scene, Jesus dictates, after appearing like this in Revelation 1, in chapter 2 and 3, he dictates 7 letters that he says, things I want to say to my 7 churches that I'm standing in the middle of. I've got something I want to say to every one of those churches. And some it's encouragement, some it's rebuke, and for most it's a combination of the both of them. Jesus has encouragement and he has challenge. He's calling us to holy living. And so chapters 2 and 3 are like this happening on the island of Patmos. And then what happens at the beginning of chapter 4, at the end of chapter 3, the curtain closes. It reopens again, and the set has changed. It says, after this, I heard a voice saying, come up here. And chapters 4 and 5, it's still Jesus, but now it's not Jesus with John on Patmos, it's now John with Jesus in heaven. And 4 and 5 is now, he has been translated up into the heavenly throne, and he sees things from a heavenly perspective. That's chapters 4 and 5. And then chapters 6 through about 11 is all this strange judgments being poured out upon the earth. God beginning to right all the wrongs of the world and bring justice. And we'll come back to some of that in the days ahead, chapters 6 to 11. And then at the end of chapter 11, the curtain closes again. And then, because that's all happening sort of from heavenly perspective, chapter 12, the curtain opens and it says, and behold, another great sign appeared in heaven. I saw a dragon. And chapters 12 through to about 16 is this evil, this forces of evil, this dragon and these ugly beasts that seem to be pouring out their judgment and trying to deceive the world. And it's all about plans of the enemy and the evil forces of this world seeming to do their worst against the world. And it can all seem hopeless at that point. But then we switch into chapters 17, 18, 19, 20, and ultimately 2021 really is the final crescendo of the whole story. And we see a new heaven and a new earth. We see the end. We get an apocalypse of the end. And it's the whole thing is there to show you that no matter what you're going through, keep your eye on chapter 21. Jesus riding a white horse with a name tatted up on his leg that says King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that nothing can ever come against. I heard a preacher say once, I've got my money on the white rider on the white horse in the last race. And I reckon that's a good way to look at it. The white rider on the white horse in the last race. That's the whole point of keep focused on the end. Keep an apocalypse of the eschaton. You with me? Yeah. So if we take it this way, take it out of the whole, I'm trying to interpret all the little bits and pieces, and just take a 30,000-foot view of the battle, the triumph of good over evil, it can encourage us. Now I want to come back just before we take communion. I want to come back to give us 2 examples of these, from these 7 letters. I'm going to read letters to 2 churches that give us an example of what I'm talking about keeping an apocalypse of the eschaton. Stay in the course. Stay focused on the victory at the end. And the correction or the challenge to not become complicit with the value system of the world. And in the book of Revelation, it's called Babylon. But it's in their context, it's the Roman Empire. It's when you see Babylon in the book of Revelation, it started in Tower of Babel. Human powers allying against God. Continue with the kingdoms of this world. Egypt was Babylon. Israel itself became Babylon at times. Then they were exiled off to Babylon. And then they were defeated by, Babylons were defeated by the Persians and the Medes, and they became the Babylon. And then they were defeated by the Greeks and Alexander the Great, and they became the Babylon. And then they were defeated by the Romans, and they became the Babylon. And you can pick your authority structure on the earth. They are all still under the power of Babylon. A power that says the world's system is allied against God's system. And the challenge is not to become complicit with Babylon, not to live by its world system. So let's start with the encouraging one. Revelation chapter 2. It's the message to the church in Smyrna. Verse 8, Jesus, on the island of Patmos there in that vision we just saw, he says, write this letter to the angel in the church in Smyrna. This is the message from the one who is the first and the last, who is dead but now alive. I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you're actually rich. I know about the blasphemy of those who seem to be opposing you. They say they are Jews, but they're not, because their synagogue belongs to Satan. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. The devil will throw some of you into prison to test you, and you will suffer for 10 days. But if you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. Now, we could go down a rabbit hole really quickly and try to work out what's the 10 days represent and what's the prison and was it in their tense or was it future tense. We could go down that rabbit hole, but let's just not do that. Let's just allow it to speak to us in the context that it was written. It was talking to a people in a town, in a church in a town, where they were suffering some kind of persecution from others who were claiming to be God's people, said, we know best, you're wrong. And they were facing this persecution, and to the point where some of them were being dragged into prison. Some of them were being persecuted to that point for their faith. And Jesus' words, if you remain faithful, even to the point of death, then I will give you the crown of life. And then you have this statement that Jesus says in verse 11, which he says in all of his words. He says in verse 11, anyone with ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what he is saying to the churches. Whoever is victorious will not be harmed by the second death. To each of these 7 churches, Jesus says something different, because each church is facing a different situation. This church is facing a different situation to Winnenoo Baptist Church. Every church, even though it might have some similarities, every church in our community has something different. So when people say, oh, Jesus is saying this to the church today, that might be true to an extent, but I'm really more interested in what Jesus is saying to our church, because Jesus has something different to say to every church, every community. He has something specific that he wants to say to encourage or bring hope to our church. What are you facing today? Take it back another level. Jesus has something specific he wants to say to you today. Every one of us individually, he's got something he wants to say to us, a word that he wants to give us. And if we will listen to that word, in their case, they were facing persecution to the point of death, and Jesus has offered them and said, hey, if you're victorious, I'm going to give you victory over the second death. In other words, even if you die a death, even if it goes all the way to the point of martyrdom, I will give you hope in the future, that there will be victory over the second death. You will have this crown of life. Life will defeat death. And to a people who hear John tell them, I saw Jesus saying that. I know it looks hard right now. I know it seems hard, but Jesus is saying if you'll stay faithful, you're going to have victory in the end, and this will all be worth it. See how that's an encouraging message? That's the encouragement. Now we have Revelation chapter 3, which is probably the other end of the spectrum. This is the church in Laodicea. I think it's actually probably the last of the 7 churches. And Jesus, he's not gentle, Jesus, meek and mild in this one. Because this church had done the opposite. They weren't facing persecution from Babylon. They had become Babylon. They had allowed the values of the Roman Empire to so infiltrate them that they looked just like Babylon. They looked like the ruling powers and authorities. They were oppressing the poor. They were living the high life. And Jesus says, you can't go on like that. And this is what he says to this church. Verse 14 of chapter 3, he says, write this letter to the angel or the messenger or the pastor of the church in Laodicea. This is the message of the one who is the Amen. That's the truth. The faithful and true witness. I see everything. I'm the beginning of God's creation. He says, I know the things you do. You're not hot and you're not cold. I wish that you were one or the other. But since you are like lukewarm water, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. You say, I'm rich. I have everything I want. I don't need a thing. And you don't realize that you're wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. So I advised to you, buy gold from me, gold that has been purified by fire. Then you'll be rich. Also white garments from me, so you will not be ashamed by your nakedness. An ointment for your eyes, so that you will be able to see. I correct and discipline everyone I love. So be diligent and turn away from your indifference. Look, I'm standing at the door and I'm knocking. If you hear my voice, open the door. I will come in and we will share a meal together as friends. Those who are victorious will sit with me on my throne, just as I was victorious and sat with my Father on his throne. Anyone with ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what he's saying to the churches. Pretty hard word. This passage, Revelation 3:20, behold, I stand at the door and knock. That was used in almost every salvation altar call by the late, great Billy Graham. That was Jesus is standing there and knocking on the door of your heart. Some of you may have heard that. While that's true, that's not who Jesus was speaking to. He wasn't talking. Who was he talking to here? He was talking to Christians. He was talking to the church. He's going, hey guys, Jesus is out there on the last doors. I'd really like to come in. But while you're living like that, there's no place for me. That's a rebuke. When Jesus is wanting to stand among the church and he can't get in the door because the church doesn't look anything like heaven. That's a rebuke that he was, I'm going to take your lampstand away, is what he's saying. I will not let this church go on representing me if you're living according to that value. Now, what was the rebuke that this church was doing? Well, a bit of context will help. And all of these 7 letters have a mixture. They're rich in Old Testament imagery, but they're also rich in local understanding of things that they understood that were taking place in their church. Now, Laodicea was a very wealthy city, one of the most wealthy cities in the area. It was well known for its export of a material that enabled it to make very, very dark black clothes, kind of like what Sash is wearing, very dark black clothes, right? Really, very, very dark that you could see. It was also known for this ointment that they would put on their eyes, this salve that they could put on their eyes that they would mine from the hills nearby, and it was like Botox, I suppose. It was like first century Botox, not 21st century Botox. It had values that would make this place very wealthy. And because they were trading in all of this stuff, they lived a very wealthy, affluent life in comparison to the people around about them. Remember the church in Smyrna? They said they were broke. They were suffering and they were in poverty. This church was the exact opposite of that. They were wealthy. They were comfortable. They had everything they needed. And the only thing they didn't have was they didn't have a natural water source next to them. They didn't have a spring nearby. But because they were so wealthy, they had built 2 large aqueducts, because in neighbouring towns, Hierapolis was one of them, I can't think what the other one was, nearby, within 4 or 5 kilometres of a town, there was 2 water sources. One was a hot water source, a hot spring, and one was a cold spring. And when Jesus says, I would rather you be hot nor cold, we've often taken that to mean Jesus wants you to be hot but not cold. But that's not what he says, because hot water is good and cold water is good. What's not good is what? Lukewarm water. And so by the time these water sources came from this hot spring and cold spring and arrived, guess what the water was? Lukewarm. It wasn't good for either by the time it arrived there. And the level of indulgence that scholars tell us that these guys got into was far worse than that. They used to have these great massive feasts where they would just indulge on all the money, all the food, because money was no problem to them. They had all the money in the world. And they would indulge on this food, and then in between courses, they would drink this lukewarm water to make themselves vomit it out so that they could fit another course in. It's a horrible thought, isn't it? But now, knowing that, Jesus says, you're not hot, you're not cold, I know what you're like, I'm going to vomit you out of my mouth. It's a pretty harsh rebuke from Jesus. It's a warning. But notice even in this warning, can we get the band to come back and join us on stage as we get ready to close? Notice even in this warning, folks, Jesus is still standing at the door and knocking. As long as he's writing this letter because he's giving them a chance. He's not saying, I'm done with you. He's saying, will you be ready for me? I'm offering to come back in and celebrate with you and be part of your church and be involved in your church. And it's these two themes that we want to carry with us. Encouragement in the face of suffering and challenge that we don't become complicit with the values of this world. And in the book of Revelation, you'll find that most of the values of the world that infiltrate the church are economic values. It's the entire economic system. And I'm sad to say, in the Christian church in the West, we don't talk about that a lot, other than to elevate the economic system and say, hey, if you want to be God's people, you're going to be wealthy. I wonder how much we've become complicit with Babylon when we do that. We make a big deal about and there are other valid social issues that we should make a deal about, the value of life. But the value of life is womb to tomb. The value of life is the value of a system, an economic system where the wealthy oppress the poor. Anyone see the news this week all about Woolies and Coles monopolising the market and all that? That's the systems of the world systems of Babylon. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about not becoming complicit with a system that allows for inequality in the world, where people suffer, where the weak suffer at the hands of the strong. That's the value systems of Babylon. And Jesus would say, don't be like that. Be different to that. Be radically passionate about the value of all life, the value of the weak, the value of the strong, the value of the rich, the value of the poor. Be passionately valued about all life. The economic systems, and later on, I think Jeannie and I talked about this, which will come out probably in a couple of weeks' time. We talked about this on a podcast. Jesus later on in chapter 18 gives a great definition of the value systems of Babylon. And it talks about how they talk about all the wealth they had, all the riches they had, all the great things that they had, the stuff they had. And then it mentions at the bottom, and human bodies, that is slaves, it says. See, the problem was the entire system of Rome was built on the back of an economy that was built on the back of slavery. It was that very thing that William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect went to the British Parliament about and said, this is not the way the world needs to work. It's not supposed to work on the value of slavery. But we might not have slavery we do have, but we might not have slavery in our Western world in terms of our economic system. But as an employer, we can enslave those who work for us. We can be subject to a system where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And the Bible has a lot to say. The book of Revelation has a lot to say about that, to call us on that. So let's stand. And I know I really feel I need to bring up that challenging component to the message this morning, so that we might ask ourselves, where are we complicit with these systems? But at the same time, that's not to diminish goal number one, that you would get an apocalypse of the eschaton. You would get a revelation of the end. That you would know that no matter how hard it seems right now, a vision of Jesus arrayed in glory, defeating the powers of darkness, overthrowing the kingdoms of this world that are allied against him. That the powers of light would defeat the powers of darkness. If you could get that revelation and hold to that, get that in your heart. That's what the purpose of this book is about. And it might look worse, and it might get worse. And to be honest, in the book of Revelation, it gets worse. And you'll see the saints crying out time and time again and saying, how long, O Lord? How long before you judge? And it seems like Jesus is holding back his judgment. Come on, Lord. When are you going to put everything right? And it gets darker and darker as these 7 bowls and these 7 trumpets blow and all these groups of 7 happen. It seems like it's getting darker and darker. And here's what I think is going on. In order for God to truly right every wrong needs to come to the surface. Every injustice needs to do its worst. The devil needs to do his worst in order that he can be rightfully judged for doing his worst. And that's what this book's saying. Things get darker and darker and harder and harder. But that's so that when the judge judges, he will judge justly. And he will truly overthrow every evil. There's no way, there's no legal recompense that the serpent can come back and say, you're not a fair judge. Because the serpent has had every chance to do everything he wants to do, and God is going to overthrow all that, judge all that, and say, now that's it, I'm banishing you, and my kingdom can come in, and it will come in, and righteousness will prevail over all evil. And that's the book. In a nutshell, that's the book. If you're facing suffering, hardship, maybe like what we're going to see Brian say next week, maybe you feel like you're crying out, oh Lord, how long before you avenge this injustice? How long before you put everything right? Maybe if you're there, then as we close our service and we take communion, Lisa and the team are just going to sing these few words. Nothing in this world can satisfy. Jesus, you're the cup that won't run dry. Your presence is like heaven to us. John needed, on Patmos, he needed to see heaven. That kept him going. And he told the church about it. That kept them going. So we're going to sing these words. When you're ready, just catch a glimpse of the presence of heaven and let it sustain you. Thank you, Jesus. Lord, as we head out into our week and we face the challenges before us, we look to you. Give us a dose of heaven on earth, Lord. Let us capture a vision of the reigning Jesus, present in our lives, present in our church, right here, right now, Lord. Lord, may nothing in our hearts keep you out. We invite you into our church. We invite you into our lives. I want to encourage you to make space for Jesus in your life. If you've been crowding him out with stuff or worries, if you've been crowding him out, make space for him. Invite him in. If you've never invited him in, you can do that. I'd love to chat with you afterwards and help you to invite Jesus into your heart. Create space for that in this place. Lord, give us that vision that will sustain us this week as we face the hardships of the last few days and the last few weeks and whatever lies before us. We don't know. But we do know, Lord Jesus, that you are truthful, that you are faithful, and that you, in the end, conquer. And because we are with you, we conquer. We overcome by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of our testimony, it says in Revelation 10, verse 11. Let us be a people who overcome through what you have done and through what we declare and testify about what you have done. Amen. Amen.